On this episode of Still Loading, we are about to embark upon a great crusade. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today on the show, we are exploring a game that is one of my personal childhood favorites. I played this game so much as a kid, and it has meant a lot to me, and I'm amazed it's taken well over 200 episodes to finally get to talking about it. Now, we were talking about Medal of Honor, the original Medal of Honor from 1999. I did do an episode years ago on Medal of Honor Frontline, but that was my, how can I describe it? Previous format is before I actually knew how the hell to podcast, and it's like a 20-minute episode, so it's nowhere near up to the standards that I accept now for my episodes. And it was a solo episode, and thank God I'm not alone on this one, unlike Medal of Honor Frontline. And to discuss Medal of Honor 1999 is my good friend Kade from the Gaming Memories podcast. Kade, how are you doing today?
I'm ready to talk about Steven Spielberg, one of the best early full 3D FPSs on the PlayStation 1, which is my favorite console of all time. So, and also a big game of my childhood. I feel like when you were on my podcast, I could have sworn you were like a Nintendo kid growing up. But you're saying Medal of Honor is like one of your childhood games, or do I remember wrong?
No, I was a Nintendo kid. I was an N64 kid growing up, but I did have I played PS1 stuff over at my uncle's. My uncle lived with my grandparents when I was a kid, and because he's like, how much older is he? He's like, I want to say like 15 or 16 years older than me. So like he was, when I was born, when I was 10, he was like in his like early to mid 30s. So he was he was all into games. And so he had a PS1. We would play Sled Storm. We would play.
Nice.
Oh, dude, I fucking love Sled Storm. As we talked about on your podcast with Garrett.
We did. That was an awesome episode.
But Sled Storm, and there was a game called Jersey Devil for the PS1 that he really liked. And it's a pretty solid 3D platformer from what I remember. But I remember also going over to some friend's house and they were playing this game. And I remember at first they're like, oh, your mom wouldn't want you to see us playing this, even though it's rated teen. I think I was like 8 or 9 at the time. Actually, I would have been 10 when this game came out. So I don't know. I don't think I would have been too young to play this game personally, but who knows? I did not have this at first, but I did save up and buy a PS1 with my own money. With I used to work for my grandfather to like cleaning his shop, and so with the little bits of money that I made from that, I saved up and got a PS1. And so I did eventually buy this for myself. And that's just how I kind of got into it at first, and then I played it a whole bunch, and I love this game. It was just something that I really it got me into World War II, like just World War II history, and I became obsessed with World War II history. I ended up watching Band of Brothers religiously, watching a lot of war movies. There's a World War II weekend that I would go to where it was like an air show, and they would have like reenactments and all. I was deep into this thing. I lived and breathed World War II history for like a number of years. Also growing up in a conservative household, like with the whole like "oorah military" type of thing.
Yeah.
My parents were not in the military, neither of them, but it was still that whole like proud to be an American type of shit. So this kind of fed all into that. And obviously I've changed a lot since then, but I still have a soft spot for Medal of Honor, and especially like the way that it kind of goes about teaching history. It's like, it's not glorifying war, but it's also not like making exploiting it. So I think it does a really, I think that's why I ended up really liking it, and it resonated with me because it struck that nice balance of not being too oorah America, but at the same time it still kind of had that reverence for military. It was like a bit of in between,
Yeah, I don't know if you want to get into it or how the structure is going to be. But I could start going off on that, or I don't know if you want to
Well, no, no. Well,
move.
go through your personal experiences. Oh,
Okay.
actually, you know what? Let me know. Do you agree with that? And then go into your personal experiences.
Yeah, I do. I think. Let's see. So I played a lot of it because I had the PS1, and my friends had PCs, and they would have all these cool FPSs, and I could play it at their house, just like you were playing this at your uncle's house. But when I got home, there wasn't a ton of FPSs. There was Disruptor on the
Yes,
PlayStation 1 that I,
Insomniac Games.
yeah, I'm pretty sure that came out prior to Medal of Honor.
It did, I believe.
So I remember that, but that had 2D sprites still in a 3D environment like old school Doom. It wasn't a full 3D like some of the games I would see my friends play on their PCs. And when Medal of Honor came out, I don't think it was the first fully 3D FPS on PlayStation 1, but it was the first one that I played and got a hold of.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't a big FPS gamer because again, I would play them at my friend's house, and I could never get into it on my own uninterrupted. It would be like I get an hour or 30 minutes and my friend wants a turn, then I got to go home. So
Mm-hmm.
this was the first FPS campaign that I ever sat down and got involved with as a kid. And the story, again, this was my first foray. I thought the story was really, really engaging. And I've replayed the game almost completely. And we'll get into some of how I played it later for this episode. But I would agree with you. It doesn't, you're good. I hadn't think about it till you brought it up, but it's not war porn. But at the same time, you still feel kind of like a hero when you
Yeah,
play it. But it's not like Call of Duty, modern Call of Duty. So I'm trying to think of the right balance. It is
it's
maybe
it's it.
tactful.
Yeah, it kind of skirts that line really well of being basically pro America propaganda, and also it doesn't like it definitely doesn't highlight the atrocities that America committed, but it also isn't necessarily glorifying what America did at the same time. It's a really, I wouldn't say it paints a full picture of the war. It's not completely going full oorah, like America, Team America, World Police,
Yeah.
shit. But at the same time, it still has this reverence for the people who served during that time, which I think, like, I don't know, maybe it's my conservative upbringing, but it's that thing where it's like, even though I don't necessarily respect my own country as much as I used to, I still respect the people who dedicate their time to it.
Yeah.
Um,
Because they're not the ones maybe making the decisions that you've grown to not respect. They
yeah,
believed in a certain ideal and they had good intentions, and oftentimes they paid for that. And whether they were used morally or immorally by the decision makers above them is, a topic for a different podcast. But I think you
yeah.
can still give reverence to those people, because I think a lot of the kids that join the military, a lot of them are bought into that idea of I want to protect, I want to serve, I want to do good, and they believe that that is a path for good.
I also think that Medal of Honor, because it focuses on World War II, it skirts around a lot of the nastier politics side of more modern wars. Where,
Yes.
like, I even remember in like Band of Brothers, the one dude, because they had interviews with the original soldiers that the miniseries was based off of, right? And one of the things that I think it was like the guy's name was Skip. I forget what his last name was, but he mentions this wasn't like Vietnam. We was attacked, is how he described it, and that is a very. I mean, I know we're not necessarily talking about Medal of Honor to talk about the politics of geopolitical shenanigans going on around World War II and since then, but I think there's a reason why being able to shoot a bunch of Nazis is never going to be a political statement.
And it's never going to be controversial.
No, because they
And,
are
and
will
that's a
always
good
be
point
the
if you think about it.
perfect
Sorry to
evil.
cut you off.
No,
It's a
no,
good
go
point
for it.
if you think about it. Is there any other group where you could just, I guess we kind of do it like you can kill a lot of Russians in video games and nobody cares. And but like outside of maybe a few of America's enemies in the past wars, like you couldn't make a game about shooting a bunch of quote insert race or people.
Hmm.
It would not fly. It would
No,
not
but
fly. but
but
you
they're
can do it
like
with Nazis.
Nazis because they actually like there's historical documented evidence
Yes.
of a genocide.
And Nazis isn't really a. I mean, it is a group of people, but it's not a race.
It's not a race. It's a
Yeah.
political identity. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think also a good point you made is there have been conflicts that America has been involved in where I feel like if you made a video game out of them, like specifically the Vietnam War, it would feel a little icky because I'm not there seems to be more evidence to suggest that we weren't maybe the best actor in the world in our involvement in
Yeah.
that. But when it comes to World War II, you probably know you seem to know more of the history than I do, but we weren't the instigators, and it took a while for us to get involved. We kind of stayed out of it, which is my philosophy on war is like you shouldn't do it unless you absolutely have no other choice.
Yeah.
It seems like that's kind of what went down with World War II, and obviously the Nazis were doing things that unanimously across the board we all going to disagree with. So it feels not so gross to play this game.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, and I that really is what it because World War II was started by Hitler in Europe. He invaded Poland, I believe, is what kicked off the war in 1939. And then obviously Japan attacked a bunch of different like South Pacific islands, and obviously they fought their way into China, and they have there's a whole. I mean, I don't know all about the history of that, but I know there is a large history of animosity between China and Japan. But like Hitler started the war in 1939. Then Japan attacked us, and because they were allied with I mean, it is kind of weird that we used the instigation of Japan's attack to be like, well, fuck it, we're going to Europe now too. It still made sense because obviously Hitler was it was just a I think that by the US's calculations. I'm not a history major or a buff with this. I would assume that they were like, well, it's just a matter of time before Hitler sets his sight to us. So
Yeah.
if now we're attacked, we're in this whether we like it or not. We didn't want to be that, but now we're into it. And once again, that's not to downplay the atrocities that the U.S. did end up committing. Arguably most famously with the atomic bomb. Still the only country on Earth to use one. Anyway.
Yeah, I think another thing that you pointed out, you have here on the history doc that I think is interesting about this time is we were talking about Nazis and why it's always okay to create media, at least in American media, you can kill a Nazi in the movies or games, whatever. And you had Wolfenstein prior to this.
Mm-hmm.
And in the notes, you have that World War II games were not common or popular at the time.
No, World War II in general was not like in the public zeitgeist.
How much time between this came out in 99?
Mm-hmm.
Wolfenstein 3D release
Wolfenstein came
date
out in the early 90s. It's less than a decade.
92. So there's 7 years in between Wolfenstein. I don't know how popular I mean, it's popular now because it's like, oh, it's the first
But would you consider that a
FPS.
World War II game per se? Like it's more
No,
like
not the same
sci-fi
way.
war. It's like alternate
Yeah,
history type of thing. And like even if you look back to like Indiana Jones, right? Indiana Jones, it all took place during the war, but it wasn't like a war film. It just took place
that's a good
around World
point.
War
I can't
II.
think of a game prior to Medal of Honor that had more of this attempt to be more like a grounded
Mm-hmm.
version, like almost like a movie that they do period pieces, right? And they spend all this time to try to get the costumes correct and recreate what a certain town or city or group of people was historically. I can't think of a game previous to Medal of Honor that did what it did. You have Indiana Jones in film, you have Wolfenstein, but that was Hitler's like in a mech with Gatling guns. I mean, this is not an attempt to make an immersive
No.
simulation of World War II,
Well,
but Medal of Honor kind of is.
and the writer producer of the game, Peter Hirschman, said, the execs at the time were really dubious about it. The World War II is old, quote unquote. It's got cobwebs on it. People want ray guns, hellspawn, and laser rifles. And then he goes on and says, the idea of doing something with historical relevance, set a low tech set in a low tech game environment was a challenging sell. And it's true because realistically at the time, if it wasn't for Saving Private Ryan and The Thin Red Line, those two really popular war movies, I don't know if Medal of Honor, I mean, it wouldn't have been
It-
because Steven Spielberg did Saving Private Ryan, one of those, and he's the one that headed up, like, who really was the driving force behind this game. He set up DreamWorks Interactive in 1995. In the article I found for research for this, they kept abbreviating DreamWorks Interactive as DWI, and I'm like, that's a driving while impaired. Like, every time I saw it, I'm just like, all I could think of was like driving under the influence. I'm like, what's wrong with you? Why would you keep abbreviating DWI? But no, so he created it in 95. This was also at a time when multimedia and interactivity was the big thing with the production company. So like every goddamn movie studio had an interactive department, Disney Interactive, and this was DreamWorks Interactive, and it was staffed by a bunch of ex-Microsoft peeps. And there was I think it's the team actually started out with 5 people, but ended up being about 30 when it got to its largest point, which is, compared to now, that's fucking
It's
tiny.
nothing. But at that time, it was probably a pretty big team.
Hmm. So yeah, they made the game. Basically, Spielberg wanted the game to be made because he wanted to teach about World War II history, but he knew that Saving Private Ryan couldn't really be shown to the vast majority of kids. So he wanted to sell it to them at a medium that they understood, and also in a way that they would be able and their parents would allow them to absorb. And so obviously they couldn't go see Saving Private Ryan. I did find it odd though. This is more towards the end of the notes, but in some of the earlier, in fact, not even earlier, pretty far into development, they had builds of this game where there was like body parts that the enemies could lose and spouting blood and shit like that. And I'm like, you wanted to sell this to kids, but you still allowed this to be in the
Well, I
game.
mean, there was like Mortal Kombat around. Maybe they were playing around with how hard in the paint they want to go. But that is interesting. I think in hindsight, I would have liked it more. I didn't know, by the way, any of this leading into it. I didn't know Spielberg was involved in this game till a
Hmm.
couple of months ago. This is like, so this is kind of fresh for me. But I think it's part of the reason why this game was as big as it was culturally now in hindsight.
Hmm.
I'm sure you I can't see in the notes. I think it sold pretty well all in all,
Yes,
right?
I didn't include in the notes. I think it ended up selling over 1 million units. I read also somewhere else 3 million, but that might be like lifetime.
Lifetime. So it was a pretty big game, but when you asked me to be on it, I was thinking about like why was this game so big? And I think you've hit the nail on the head. This because of the Steven Spielberg situation and Saving Private Ryan has sort of primed the pump, and he had that experience, or he had the experience of making that. Again, I can't think. I've been racking my brain of an FPS that was trying to be as true to the history without being alternate or fantasy and laser guns and
Hmm.
whatever. I can't think of one previous to Medal of Honor. I'm sure on the PC there were some, but most of the FPSs were, had some sort of crazy fantasy setting, whether it's Doom or whatever. And as a kid playing this game, it felt like you were playing a movie because you had the briefings, they give you like your mission, there was dialogue, and even though it was the first FPS campaign that I had the the ability to sit by myself and get fully immersed in, it was
Hmm.
also, now that I think about it, and you brought up these notes, arguably maybe the first campaign story wise, setting and world building and attention to detail to be grounded in history, one of the first to ever do it. And maybe that's why this game online has always been kind of a big deal.
I mean, yeah, it was the trope of World War II first person shooters did not exist
Did
until
not
this game.
exist.
This
Yes.
created the trope.
Yes.
It also is one of the earliest examples of marrying film and games pretty effectively, because they have these really kind of good, well produced mini documentaries at the beginning of each mission, voiced with a really professional sounding narrator. I don't know off the top of my head who did the voiceover for the narration of those little mini docs, but it's really interesting. You mentioned Steven Spielberg. Yeah, 100%. Like, he is the driving force behind it. And I think the fact that he probably pushed it. Additionally, fun fact, his son, Max, who was only around 14 or 15 at the time this game was in development, did QA for this game. He he worked
Mm.
in quality assurance for it, and his son Max still works in the games industry. He has gone on to he did like GoldenEye Rogue Agent. He worked on that game. His son is a big time, like he's been in the game industry for 20 years now, and he actually runs his own game studio, I think called Fuzzybot Productions. I'm Fuzzybot Games, excuse me. Or sorry, it's just called Fuzzybot. That's what I googled, was Fuzzybot Games, and yeah, he runs that, and it's led by. He worked at EA. He's worked at a bunch of different places. It's wild. And it's just kind of funny to see that he. I don't know if this was his first job in games in general, but there was a quote that I think I have farther down where he talks about how he he had been on film sets for almost all of his life up to that point, because obviously, Steven Spielberg, his dad. I actually found the quote. I'd grown up around movie sets and studios, but I've never felt more excited than walking around DreamWorks Interactive, once again
Mm.
abbreviated as DWI. This place was where they used the building blocks and green army men to map out the next level. I mean it. It was basically taking all my tangible childhood toys and bringing them to life. So he loved doing this. He loved being able to work on this game. Um, yeah, it's kind of wild. And actually, one other real quick thing I mentioned before about how the gore and violence, and how it was odd that they included it, even though Spielberg was trying to sell it to a younger audience. The reason it got kicked off, they removed the gore and violence, is because there was two things that happened during development that almost completely derailed the entirety of the development. One was Columbine.
Mm.
Uh, Columbine happened. I forget, was that in 97 or 98? I'm trying to remember. Or was it 99? I was a little bit too young to really. It,
99.
it was
99.
99,
Yeah.
April 20th, 1999. And this game came out in 1999, so it was a really calculate. They weren't quite sure what they should do with it, because
Mm.
of the massacre. It put FPSs square in the sights of any
Yes.
anti-video game media, parents,
Yes.
politicians, all that stuff. They ultimately decided to release it because I think the reason they got away with it as well is because this game clearly wasn't exploitative. It was meant to be more of a bizarre combination of it. In a weird sense, it's edutainment. You know,
That's true. Edutainment. That's a good word.
it's a weird. It's not quite like, when you think of edutainment, you think of Math Blaster, you think of Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. So I wouldn't quite. I think it's a little bit more on the tainment side than the edu side, but
But there is a
still,
flavor of it for sure.
100%. And the other half of it was Paul Bucha. I don't know how you pronounce his last name. He was the president of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, and he was pissed off that the game was called Medal of Honor. He thought it was a dishonor to all the people who served and received the Medal of Honor, the actual medal that the name is, comes from. His mind did get changed when Hirschman, like I mentioned before, Peter Hirschman, he was the writer and producer, invited him over to see the game for himself, invited Paul Buca to see the game for himself. And not only did it change his mind, but it actually went the complete opposite direction. And the Congressional Society, the Medal of Honor Society, endorsed the game afterwards. And there's a quote from the art director, Matt Hall, saying, at one point, Spielberg was willing to cut his losses and just pull it for themselves. And it was Hirschman's intervention that saved it. And I quote, Peter is a really humble guy. He never toots his own horn, continues the art director. This is a quote from the Games Radar article I found this on. But he saved that franchise. I would wager that well over half of the people at DreamWorks Interactive didn't know that story. So because Hirschman decided to at least try to add some context to it for Paul Buca, the president of the Medal of Honor Society, the series might not have ever happened between these two things, kind of all occurring, excuse me, at the same time.
Yeah, that's it. I didn't knew none of this before, and I had glazed in notes, but I didn't read all of them. I had no idea, and that makes sense because the word I mentioned before is the story felt grounded.
Mm-hmm.
And now this makes sense because Hirschman went through all the trouble to ground it with real history and put that little bit of that flavor of the edu and the edutainment. But as some of these quotes you just mentioned, he didn't want people to think it wasn't a game, which that's actually really really cool. It makes a lot of sense. I'm glad this game came out because it didn't spawn. I mean, it did spawn like I guess the cliche World War II military shooter that isn't that educational.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that that's a really interesting mix that they tried to do, and I wish more people would do it. And I think you're getting to the spirit of why this game is special, which I didn't know all this stuff until we started talking about it, and that makes total sense. I was thinking all week, like, why? What is it so? What's so good about this game? I don't know. The campaign just always felt so visceral and real. And as a kid, I didn't know that it was inspired by history, and I didn't know that maybe I was learning little tidbits of real history, but it made the campaign so much more immersive because I think subconsciously you could sense that it was grounded in something real.
Yeah, and it's funny how that the limitations of the game kind of added to being able to ground it in realism. So some of the technical limitations they had to deal with, right? They couldn't have. I mean, this game is basically, from the way they describe it, I don't know if this is actually true or not. Any game devs out there listening to this, let me know if this is true. But from my understanding, this was really pushing the PS1 to its limits because you could only have, I think, up to 3 or 4 enemies on screen at once. I think 4 was the max. So they had to use a lot of quote unquote smoke and mirrors in order to
Mm.
hide enemies, and like it's in order to for them to have more than 3 or 4 on screen at the same time. The game was so technically like difficult to for the system to handle. That's why every mission occurs at night, because they literally couldn't render a skybox.
Ah.
And limitations breed creativity, as I have said before, and I forget where I that's not my quote. I got that from somewhere and I feel bad where I got it from, but limitations breed creativity, and that worked out really well in their favor because that's you're a spy. You work for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. What are spies doing most of the time? Sneaking around at night,
You're
sneaking
not
in
fighting 100 guys at once with a giant Gatling gun. Yeah.
Exactly. You are
Yeah.
sneaking around at night. In fact, there was also even in terms of like the intentionality of the narrative, the reason why you start off as a paratrooper named Jimmy Patterson, or no, sorry, you're a pilot, is because they wanted you to feel kind of almost not a kinship, but similar to the character. It was a way for you to connect the player to connect with the character because you, the player, did not go through basic training, months and months of basic training.
Clearly the
Uh,
pilot. Yeah.
Now the pilot did as well to an extent, but like not necessarily in terms of the amount of, uh, weapons training and strategy and all this other stuff. So you're a pilot that gets shot down during like D-Day night. If I hold on, I actually have the missions in front of me. June 12th, 1944. So this is actually 6 days after D-Day, according to the dates that all this all occurred. But like you also don't have that same experience. So you, the player, and Jimmy Patterson, the character, have about the same level of experience, quote unquote, as much as possible. Which is they did that on purpose in order to make the player feel a little bit more connected with good old Jimmy. And yeah, it's really cool how they kind of constructed this, and that's where they got the whole Secret Service thing. So he kind of they worked the Secret Service thing into the technical limitations and vice versa. They kind of informed each other, for lack of a better term. Um, and even at the time when they first started developing it, they were like, "How the fuck are we going to put a first-person shooter on PlayStation?" Christopher Cross, the lead designer, I found a quote from him from that Games Radar article, and I quote: "The idea to do a first-person shooter on the PlayStation was fucking crazy. These days, you think of someone saying you." excuse me. These days, you think of someone using, say, the Unreal Engine and building a whole level by themselves. We couldn't do that. We had to be very careful with the amount of polygons that we used on the hardware. An enemy in Medal of Honor is maybe 200 polys. That's actually, I believe it's 250 was the 250 to 300 was the actual amount that I saw later on. Anyway, um, and the quote continues, today, they don't even make hats that are less than 200 polys. So we could only have 4 enemies on screen at once. We had to work with smoke and mirrors so players wouldn't notice the enemies were backfiling. Also, we had to cut the skyboxes. That's why every level takes place at night. In the end, though, it kind of worked out since you're playing an OSS officer doing secret missions. It added a lot of atmosphere. Peter Hirschman also elaborated in a different, I don't know, this might have been from the same interview. Enemies had 250 polygons max. It's laughable today, says Hirschman. We had a hierarchical animation system that we thought was pretty cutting edge. We blew our memory budget running on a console. We blew our memory budget running that on a console with only 2 megabytes of memory.
Yeah, it is interesting. There was not a lot of there was not a FPSs on the PlayStation 1 at the time. And that's probably why I was so hyped for this game, because because it was technically difficult. That makes sense too. I hadn't really thought about that, but how hard it would be to do an FPS on the PS1. And this next section on the notes about the controls makes a lot of sense too. The traditional console control scheme for FPSs had not been figured out by this time. That I think Alien Isolation, or was it called not Isolation? Alien. It's not Trilogy. What's the Alien game on PlayStation 1?
I don't. Aliens and Colonial Marines? I don't know. No, that's a PS1 game. Or,
Alien
I mean, a PC game. I'm not. I really don't know.
It's not Trilogy. There's Alien Trilogy, and then there's the other Alien one. Alien Resurrection. Yes. So Alien Resurrection is credited for being the first game to port the traditional dual stick analog modern control scheme for an FPS on a console. But that came out in 2000, so that was a year later. And like you have in your notes, the analog controller hadn't really come out yet when they were developing this. So it was a big technical hurdle, not just with the memory and the visuals to create a FPS on the PlayStation 1, but even how you're going to control the game was still an open-ended question and had not been standardized yet.
In fact, so much so, at the time of development, the analog joystick controller wasn't even out. They started developing this game midway through that being a thing. Like midway through the development is when the analog controller even was a thing. So they had to basically just go. They had to make the game with the idea that not everyone is going to have this analog controller because they didn't know if it was going to stick or not.
Yes. Yep.
And that's why they had to design around it intentionally. Because of that control scheme, they designed around that limitation, which is why I think the game works so well. There's a part in one of the articles that I read, I forget which one, where basically it allowed, because of that limitation, say there was 3 enemies in front of you, you might shoot 1 or 2 in like the arm or leg, and then take your time and aim on the third guy, because the other guys are like, oh my gosh, I've been shot, and like holding their arms and shit like that. And then you can take your time and aim at the third guy and take him out in one shot, and then you move back to the other 2. So you had to almost strategize how you were going to take out the enemies.
And that was novel at the time. I remember, again, I don't know if it was the first game to do some of those things, but most games, like a Doom clone or Doom or Wolfenstein, Disruptor, all these games, when you kill an enemy, there's a set animation for when that enemy dies.
Mm-hmm.
But Medal of Honor, they would react. If you shot them in the foot, they would hop around on one foot. If you shot them in the legs and they died, they would fall forward. If you shot them in the shoulder, they would roll back. They would react differently based on where you shot them. And at the time, that was really novel for me as a kid. And if there were games that did it prior to them, those games didn't penetrate the market enough for me to be aware of them. So this was, now that we're talking about it, like one of the first times I ever saw that. And I actually could think of a specific set of characters in the first level, which is called, I can't remember what it's called. the down plane, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you have these turrets, and you come around a corner, and there's, like they said, 3 enemies, which now makes more sense because they could only have 4 at a time. I didn't know that. So
Yeah.
yeah, you have all these situations where there's like 3 guys, 2 to 3 guys, and you have to, if you try to kill both of them at the same time, you're going to get lit up. So you have to like disable, kill someone, and then come back. And there's an alcove in that first level where there's also a gun, like a mounted turret. Which
Mhm.
again, I don't remember games previous to Medal of Honor. Again, probably not the first one to do it, but it's the first time that I got to use a mounted turret in an
That
FPS.
was yeah. Sorry, I cut you off. Finish what you were saying.
That's it. I mean, it's like all these things now are making more sense to me as you've done this research on the development of the game, of why this game was so engrossing as a kid, and why both of us spent. I mean, I played this game a lot, like over and over and over again. I beat this game multiple times,
Mhm.
and because you get to the point where you memorize the enemies, and yeah, it forced you to come up with these strategies where, okay, if I want to get through the whole level with no damage or beat my previous time, when I get here, I shoot this guy in the foot, that guy in the arm, this guy in the head, grab the mounted turret. I know there's 2 guys coming down here, kill 2 of those, grab this. And it all grounded in this like art style and history and the briefings and the videos. This was a special, like I'm getting pumped. Like this was a special game. This game is, it's still good, by the way. I replayed it for this
It
podcast
is
or some of it.
actually.
It's still good.
Also, what's fucking wild, so I played my original version on my PS3. You can adjust the control scheme to be pretty damn close to modern standards.
I
Uh,
was gonna bring that up. I didn't know the PS3 version had that,
well, it's not. It's the original PS1 version that I'm just playing on my PS3. Like,
but they've obviously implemented like a controller profile or something, so
well,
you
no,
could.
because it's the original disc. That's what I'm saying. Like, it's not like I downloaded it from the PS3 thing. Like, they didn't implement like a controller profile. It was all included from the get go. I mean, I guess technically they did, but like from the
Huh,
get go. But
interesting.
the
That's
point I'm trying to
awesome.
make is that this wasn't an addition. This wasn't something that like they changed, all these years later to make it more palatable for a modern audience. It was built into the disc as it was.
With an analog controller?
At least it allows for it. Yeah.
I
I
wonder. I should try. I need to test that because I spent a lot of time on emulation on an emulator DuckStation remapping the controls and like saying left and right is not the D-pad, but it's this over here on your right thumbstick. And I got it to work just by remapping the controls to play like a standard modern first-person shooter with a dual joystick controller. But it took me like a good 30 minutes to 40 minutes to figure that out. The game didn't recognize that I had, because you can set on the emulator what controller are you emulating, and I want to emulate a DualShock analog controller so I can do this control scheme. And the game didn't recognize, just because I had a DualShock analog controller, it didn't change anything. So I'm wondering if that was like a quality of life thing added. But you said it's just a disc, so I don't see. Yeah, I don't get how that would work because
I
you're just
mean, I
putting the
do
disc
have
in.
like the greatest hits version of the disc, which usually comes out, but
Maybe.
I don't know if there would be any difference between the greatest hits and the original. I don't. I would assume no, but it's still possible. Um,
Or maybe
because
I just went through all that work for nothing. But either way, we both got to play the game with the more traditional control scheme
that we're used to, yeah. Because the original one, it was like you would move forward, you would move backward and forward on the D-pad,
on the
and
D-pad.
then you would look left and right, and I believe you could strafe with like the L's and R's or something like that.
Yeah, you would do L and R to strafe, and then the same D-pad would turn. So like strafing was weird because you would have to use the D-pad and strafe with the shoulder button. And then I think it was left trigger or right trigger. One of them, they would do the similar thing that GoldenEye did, where you would stop and a little crosshair would come up,
Hmm.
and then you could aim that crosshair, but you would be stationary. You couldn't move and aim at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a little. It still reeks of that older style of FPS, but like it's once again it's designed around that. I think while I love GoldenEye still, it is I find aiming on that a little bit harder, and I don't know why. But if you don't aim down the sight, if you don't use the actual like reticule, I should say, the auto aim is pretty damn accurate. Like you just aim in the general vicinity and you just kind of shoot at them.
Yeah.
Um, Now some of the other cool things about this, so locational or like I guess damage based on the location you shoot the enemy was not new for this, because like GoldenEye did it. You could shoot a dude in the arm in GoldenEye, and he'd like
When did GoldenEye come out?
97.
Ah.
However, what this game did do was that there was a lot of visceral things you could do to the enemies that were different that you had not seen. One of the most, I think, like, it's not visceral in terms of how violent it is. I mean, I guess it is a little violent. You can shoot the helmets off of enemies and you hear that boom sound. And it's such a satisfying thing. Like, it it is such a visceral sound effect and like visual, because you see like the guy kind of jolt back from the impact and then the helmet flies off somewhere else. It's a really, like, it's satisfying, as fucked up as it is to say that you just shot a helmet off of somebody's head. But then also when you throw grenades, you could, the enemies would either kick them back at you, they might kick them away, they might throw them away, they might jump on them. Apparently, if you throw a grenade when a dog is nearby, the dog will pick it up like it's playing fetch and bring it back to you.
I I don't know if that ever happened.
It didn't happen to me. When I was reading in all the interviews, they said it happened. I'm like, really? But then at the same time, generally when dogs are coming, I'm not throwing grenades. I'm just shooting at them.
Yeah,
So I
because
don't know.
that second level in, like, the catacombs, the
Mhm.
dogs, oh, yeah, you're just blasting those. You're not
And you
I'm
just hear them, like, the sound design in this game is fucking
Yes,
fantastic.
that's what I was gonna bring up next is
Go for it.
specifically in that second level. So for those who haven't played, the first level, you crash like a plane, you're in the forest. The second level, you enter a building and you go down in what is some sort of tunnels, not catacombs, but underground tunnels to a building. It's just mainly tunnels, a few big rooms. And they changed. I love the PS1 reverb, by the way, the reverb that the PS1
Mhm.
hardware produces. And they used it really well here, depending on the size of the room, or I don't know if it's individual in the second level, but the reverb of the gunshots in the first level in an open forest sounded different when you're down under the ground and these tunnels. You get a longer tell, and it sounded like, oh, I'm down here in like a brick building shooting a gun. And I can hear the difference between the footsteps and the voices. The reverb was all there.
Mhm.
I don't think, now that I'm remembering, I think it was like the standard reverb for the whole level, that like it wouldn't change based on the size of the room. I think that's stuff that happened later. But that little detail that the sound design would change, they would add this layer. Oh, we're going to make the reverb tail longer and bigger because you are in a different environment, and it's those touches and the guns. I mean, obviously this is an old game, but I think the guns still sound awesome. I played
They
this week.
actually uh they actually recorded that live at Dale Dye's ranch. So the military advisor, Dale Dye, he's pretty famous now because he's been the military advisor in a lot of war films, Saving Private Ryan being probably his most famous, but he also did Band of Brothers, that whole miniseries. Um, he also was skeptical at first when they first were making this game. He also showed up at their studio, and once he saw, that they're trying to treat it's not meant to be exploitative. It's meant to be educational and show reverence. He uh, also kind of softened on his view on it, and so they all went over to his ranch and shot era accurate weapons. The actual World War II weapons, and recorded the audio there at his ranch, apparently, from what I read.
That is badass. I mean, again, this is an interesting episode for me because I didn't look at the notes prior. I just played the game to remind myself of what it was like, and I was a big game as a kid, and all the things that I like about it are now making sense. We were getting into the sound design. Oh, the sound design was awesome. Well, no wonder they
Dude,
got
and you
like actual real World War II guns and recorded them. And the PlayStation at the time,
mhm.
the CD audio was available on PC, but for console owners, it's probably one of the earliest times where we've experienced maybe
Yes.
that level of attention to detail in audio.
I don't know if it was the first one, but it definitely was one of the earliest. It was also one of the earliest to use a full orchestral soundtrack, like a live recorded orchestral soundtrack. Do you know who the composer of this game is?
I do not. Is it in the
M- He's huge now, Michael Giacchino. He is more well known for the Pixar films. He did The Incredibles. He did Up. He's done. I
Oh,
think he
wow.
did Inside Out. I believe. I don't know all of his movies, but I know he did Incredibles and Up for sure. I think he even won an Academy Award for some of the music in Up, I believe, or maybe a Grammy. But dude is an absolute legend. He's one of the most iconic composers of all time. And he got one of his earliest credits is the Medal of Honor series. A lot of the music that you hear in the first handful of games, I believe even up to Frontline, which was like 2001, maybe three. I don't remember exactly. But I think it was 2003. I don't know. It was 2001. But he did Allied Assault. He did, Medal of Honor Frontline. He did Underground. He did all of these. I think he did Underground. I don't know off the top of my head, but he is an iconic composer, and it shows. I think the soundtrack for this game is really fucking good.
Yeah, it's just like kind of blowing my mind. I knew this game was a big deal and it was popular, but I did not know all this stuff. Spielberg, I guess I didn't know Spielberg was involved till recently. The whole thing about his son going on to do his own game studio, the writing, the historical stuff, I sort of sensed as a kid. Makes a lot more sense. Now you're bringing up the audio, and then this G. How do you say his last name? Giacchino.
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 I think that's how you pronounce it.
I'm not aware of him, but I'm looking him up. Oh yeah, I've seen all these movies. Yeah, okay.
He did
And he's got a
Alias. He composed Alias as well, I think.
damn, yeah. And he was on Medal of Honor. This game is crazy. Like I had no idea.
There's and the team, it's one of those things where it's like all these people came together at like the perfect time. It was a pretty close-knit group of people that worked on this game, and it really shows how much. I mean, they 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 were close in, and so they crafted a really amazing game. But some of the one of the wildest stories. I don't know if you read this in the notes already, but this, um, I was telling you off mic about this, and actually, I got this. I totally forgot to do this. I wanted to shout it out at the beginning of the episode, but I will shout it out now. Pat Hickey Jr. He's been on my podcast three times before. He's been on your podcast at least it was twice, Cade?
Twice.
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 He has a series of books called The Minds Behind the Games, and he has a book on PS1 games, The Minds Behind the PS1 games. And dude, Pat does amazing work, and he's such a fucking champ because I didn't have the money right now to buy his Minds Behind the PS1 games, but he was nice enough just to send me the chapter on Medal of Honor anyway. I will be buying the Minds Behind the PS1 book, but like listeners, if you want to support a nice dude, he sent me this chapter to help me out for this episode. And in this chapter, he interviewed a dude named Michael Heilman, who was one of the programmers for it. I don't know if I pronounce his last name, but Heilman. He just talking about like the camaraderie of this development team. They had lots of barbecues, and here's his quote: "We had barbecues once in a while on the deck outside the office. Once we had a piñata. I can't remember the actual occasion for it now," Heilman said. "One of the artists went outside and pulled out a katana from his office and managed to cut through the extension cord we were using to hoist it, which ended that whole party pretty quickly. It also got him fired, a written warning, and weapons were banned from the office. I'm still not sure how he managed to get the blindfold on and start swinging it."
Wow. That's actually a pretty cool story, and that's why I like his books. Just another shout out to Patrick Hickey Jr. We've both tried to get guests on the show. It's a lot of work to get this kind of inside information. A lot of emailing, a lot of no's. And that's why his books are awesome. I actually own the book. I have not finished it. I had not read. I should have read the Medal of Honor section. I forgot it was in it. I basically bought it for a couple other games because I knew there's some games in there that I really wanted to know about. I'm going to go back and read that section. What is crazy to me is I guess it's not that big of a deal if you bring a sword into a video game studio because like swords are in nerd culture and anime and katanas. But I guess no one batted an eye when he like pulled it out and started swinging. I mean, I don't know. That's kind of a wild story. I wonder how much they were drinking. Did they put that in there?
I'm happy he was very tasteful in telling the story and didn't mention who this person was decided to bring in a katana into the office. I just, oh my god, I can't get over it. Um, yeah, but yeah, this game is just, it's incredible, dude. Like, it really is amazing what they were able to pull off. Like, so it's funny. My notes for this, like, you can see they're about 5 pages long, and a lot of this I literally did today, like during my kid's nap. I'm like, oh shit, I know some behind the scenes stuff, but let me get this all written down. And I just kept finding more and more stuff. Like, just even like, what is it? And when the development started for the game, it actually started on November 11th, 1997. Uh, Spielberg was wrapping up principal photography on Saving Private Ryan, and he came to the office to like basically pitch the game to the office, even though he set up the studio. And a lot of the execs thought it was dumb because, once again, World War II was not selling at the time. That was not a thing. Um, but then obviously with Saving Private Ryan and The Thin Red Line, and also Tom Brokaw's book The Greatest Generation, and all this other stuff kind of coming out, um, when he met with the team and he pitched it, he kind of said his piece. He's like, all right, I'll be back in a week. And so they had a week to make a mock-up demo, and they used the engine of their previous game, which was the Lost World Jurassic Park, to mock up a demo for Medal of Honor. It's wild how all these things kind of, like, I don't know, just kind of blend with each other. It all these people kind of got hired all around the same time. Some of them, in fact, I forget who. One of the guys I was reading left DreamWorks Interactive before the game even came out, and it might have been Hirschman actually, but he was like, he was well taken care of afterwards. And he ended up working for LucasArts, I want to say. I forget, but a lot of the people went on to do amazing things. In fact, I think what's really tragic about this game, though, uh, despite how well it did at the time, DreamWorks Interactive was not doing well. So before the game came out, the company was hemorrhaging money, so they sold DreamWorks Interactive to EA. So EA got to publish the game, even though DreamWorks Interactive made everything, and that they owned all the rights wholesale at that point. And then it became Medal of Honor that we know it.
Yeah, I was actually gonna. I'm glad that was a perfect segue. My next question is: I pulled up the Wikipedia on the series. One, I didn't realize there was that many games in the Medal of Honor series. It went on to a lot of games, so obviously there was enough sales for the brand to continue. But for me, I only played one and Underground, and now I'm looking at it, and it makes
Really?
sense. Those were the only two that were developed by DreamWorks, and they were both on the PlayStation One. And then by the time it came out on PS2, um, I was not. It says Allied Assault
That's a
was on.
PS1
That's
exclusive. Or sorry,
no Allied
PC.
PC
PC.
exclusive. Yeah, yeah. So I didn't play that. Yeah, I played. So Underground, you play the girl. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I
You
played.
play Manon Baptiste, who is a resistance fighter, and that she's actually one of the people you speak with a lot in this game. Like, she's one of the people giving you, your character Jimmy, information
Yes.
and stuff like that.
Yeah. So it's. I didn't know that's why the series switched to EA, which is unfortunate because you said it sold 4 million, right? Three
Something like, it
million.
was like 3 million lifetime. It sold really, really. EA was expecting it to sell 750,000, and I believe it ended up selling 1 million within the time frame they wanted the 750K to, and it ended up selling more than that even. So
So I did well, but yeah, so because of macro video game industry and publisher stuff, they end up selling to EA, and yeah, it became this different brand. And then I'm looking at like it went from EA Los Angeles, TKO, EA Los Angeles, Netherrock, EA Los Angeles, Team Fusion for 2006 Medal of Honor Heroes, back to EA LA for the next few,
the
and then
series has been about, I mean, its most recent entry, it's now a VR game. It's Medal of Honor Above and Beyond, I want to say.
that's
Um,
Respawn. Yeah.
yeah, the thing is, the series has had a history of like in fact, the series directly led to Call of Duty eventually. A lot of the developers, I want to say, who did Allied Assault ended up leaving and creating Infinity Ward. But from what I understand of that, at least, yeah. So like some of the creators of Infinity Ward, the people who started it, cut their teeth on Medal of Honor Allied Assault for the PC. Like the series has had a very long reaching tendrils from their kind of humble beginnings. What this completely, not related off. This is a awful non sequitur, whatever. But we were talking about DreamWorks Interactive. Do you remember the little intro to the games? Where you see the kid on the moon, and they always have he puts on like the little helmet and he jumps off of it.
Yes.
I fucking love that, dude. It's such a charming little like they changed it up for Underground where they did a little bit different, and then after that one they got rid of it. It bummed me out. I always thought it was such a fun
Well, it
like
wasn't
little thing.
DreamWorks after that. Yeah, yeah, that
It
makes
wasn't
total
DreamWorks, yeah.
sense. Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. Not totally, it's only semi related to Medal of Honor, but one of my favorite things about retro games as a kid, I would get really excited for logos and title screens. I
Mhm.
always found them, like you said, something about an intro with the logo, and then I would get really excited to like, I'd rent a game, like, oh, what's the title screen going to be like? 'Cause that's your first sort of experience, and I don't know, I would nerd out about title screens. Now Medal of Honor's title screen, I don't remember anything specifically special about it, but what I do remember being engrossing and awesome is the briefings, right? You like there's like this table, and then you sit down and you get briefed on what's going on, and then
Mhm.
you get these like little video briefings before each mission. So not totally a title screen, but I would nerd out on that because at the time that was like really novel and it was well done, and I still find it to be well done. Again, I replayed most of the game this week. I went through the first 4 levels and then watched basically the rest of it on YouTube. Um, and I was into it. Like with the modern control schemes we talked about, I don't know if you experienced this on PS3. The game is considerably easier when you can
Yes.
control it like a standard. So I was kind of just running through levels and blasting people with really no resistance. So it made the pace a little less slow, but the entire game was super immersive. And now I know why, because they, as you mentioned earlier, they designed this game to be slow because of the technical limitations, graphics and memory, AI, but also because of the D-pad. They didn't have the analog stick. They
And
weren't
then they
sure
wrote
about.
the story around that too.
They wrote the story, and it was like it was all master planned, and they took into account their limitations and engineered around that, which makes sense. And that's probably why it spawned this giant series with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9,
A
10,
lot.
11, 12, 13, 14, 15, like 8, 6, 17, 18 games. Um, it's a big deal. And you brought up another point that I didn't start thinking of until we started talking, which was Medal of Honor really gave birth to Call of Duty.
Yeah, I
If
mean
there
it.
is no Medal of Honor, there's no Call of Duty.
Yeah, not at least the version of Call of Duty that we know.
Yes.
Yeah, no, and something that about this game, just speaking of the gameplay, the levels you're talking about, you played through the first four. I actually replayed it for the first time in years earlier this year on stream on Twitch. And I had never beaten this game as a kid, actually. I got to the final level. So the final level is a kick in the dick, man. Like that, it the difficulty shoots up really fast. And even with the modern controls, they just send an obscene amount of enemies, like wave after wave at you, and there are turrets and stuff like that, but you can't see all the enemies at the same time, so you have to keep switching turrets and like adjust, like dodging, and it's really tough. And there's but it's a very short final level where essentially you start off in like a train tunnel, you come out, there's like a, I think it's one of like there's like a cannon, like a rail cannon or something like that you have to blow up. It might not even be a rail cannon, it just might be like munitions or some shit. I forget exactly what the mission is. You know what? I will I have the
Looks
list
like
in
it's
front of
called
me.
Vengeance Production.
Well, it's the last level's
Oh,
called Gotterdammerung. I don't.
Otto Dommerberg. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
got a lot of umlauts in that shit, so I'm not sure. Guterdamerung? I don't know. Um, But basically you have to a lot of the game revolves around you sabotaging different aspects of Nazi science experiments. The V2 rocket is a real thing. You know, it was something that's basically a proto-nuclear bomb from my understanding. In this mission, you are basically trying to um take the V2 rocket that's scheduled to go off, and you need to basically make it so it blows up the base itself, and you can hide in a bunker that is quote unquote V2 proof. I forget exactly what they call it, but basically you launch the rocket off and you watch it come back down on the base because you sabotage the rocket, and it blows up the German base, but you're in a bunker that keeps you safe from it somehow,
I'm literally watching it right now. Like the
even though
timing
you're
is
like
perfect.
right fucking next to it, which
Yeah,
makes
you're
no
like
fucking
you
sense.
launch the rocket. You're like in this little bunker that's next to and then these scientists run out, and it's three scientists. Surprise, surprise! 'Cause you only have so many characters on screen. They run
Yep.
out and they put their heads back, like "Oh my god!" And then the rocket comes down and blows them all up, and you get this sweet victory video. And then you see what we talked about earlier. They have this. It looks like real footage of Eisenhower speaking. Is that his name? The president at the time?
President was Roosevelt, was
Was it
Franklin Delano
Roosevelt?
Roosevelt. The
Yeah, I don't know
Eisenhower
my
was
presidents, but yeah.
Eisenhower did become a president, but at the time he was the commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. He was in
Okay.
charge of all of the Allied military.
Then they show a video of what looks like a real video of a rocket tipping over and exploding, like a FMV sequence. I
Hmm.
don't. It's just interesting how they, and a lot of games in the '90s did this, where they would incorporate film or CGI or at the time we called them FMV sequences, full motion video. Sometimes they were film shot on camera, sometimes they were computer generated. But this game, I'm just going through and like watching. We've talked about this already, but it incorporated more than I remember, um, and it gave it this sense of realism when you're like you you're peppering in these videos of people who were involved in World War II talking, and I don't know. It's just we were kind of beating a dead horse at this point, but this game was awesome. Like I'm like realizing in real time as we're recording, this game is better than I remember, and it's better than even playing it this week in preparation because I played it pretty casually. Like you're mentioning, you can run through it with modern controls and
Pretty
kind of
easily,
just
yeah.
blast through it, and I wasn't getting fully immersed, and I was skipping cutscenes, and I think I did myself a disservice. I think I need to go back and play it and play through it like the lights off, slow, and get into the game.
Especially like that first mission, man, it is so immersive because it's at night, you don't really hear anything other than you don't you can hear the sounds of war off in the distance. You hear like kind of random noises, like random people shouting and things like that,
Yes.
and it just really does immerse you into this atmosphere of like you just got shot down behind enemy lines. And now games would be able to make it a lot more immersive, but for 1999 I remember being very, especially with the music sting, because the music was really well implemented throughout the game, where it would like it was very well implemented throughout the game, where like it was very minor musical stings. Every now and then you hear like a dun, like a little
Like
sound,
a
but other
stab or something. Yeah.
yeah, and it wasn't really synced up to any of the events, so it kind of fell through, but it was ambient. And there was times where you would have a melody, especially when you were on like an urgent part of the mission. You hear like dun 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 dun. uh and it would repeat a lot. It kind of sounded Star Wars ish, but yeah, it just, I don't know, the music worked really well. It added to the atmosphere, I think. And the one thing I love about this era of first person shooters, maybe it's because some of the first FPSs I played were Medal of Honor, that when you kill an enemy, they don't come back. It's not like there's infinitely respawning
Yes.
enemies, where like you can run back through a level and it's just empty. It's this like empty, lonely hallway where you're just kind of listening to the music and admiring the visuals. And it kind of makes it feel a little bit more like an OSS spy mission. I mean, granted, I have no like frame of reference for that, but like, like
Wait, you're
you
not secretly a spy? And you're not telling us?
not that I can tell you. If I told you, I'd have to kill you. Um, but yeah, it's just kind of, I don't know. I don't know really how to describe it, but I just, the atmosphere of this game I think is great. And another cool thing this game did, by the way, this is not a great a segue, but fuck it. They varied up the mission types. You never saw a
I
mission with
was
stealth.
I was just going to talk about this. So one of the fourth mission, I think, or third mission,
Mm-hmm.
is where you're like at a train station and you have to show a guy your papers,
Mm-hmm.
and then you kind of get past the door, and you're like, that whole mission is basically a stealth mission. You have to go through, and you're not really supposed to kill everyone. And I think this was in your notes too. I don't know if every mission does this, but that mission specifically, like, you can go through the whole mission and not kill anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw somewhere in your notes, I thought one of the quotes was something along that lines, where one of the developers said, we didn't want to make like, oh yeah, right here, quote from Christopher Cross. Plus, killing enemies was never meant to be an objective, never meant to be something you had to do to finish a level. Modern games have these cardboard cutouts popping up all the time. It's just the test of your switch skills. With Medal of Honor, and then you touched on this, quote, you'd need to shoot one guy in the foot, one guy
Mm-hmm.
in the hand, then one guy in the head. But prior, which is kind of a weird quote, because he's saying you don't have to kill everyone. Then he talks about shooting people. But obviously, it wasn't like you didn't always have to kill someone. And this mission, this stealth mission, I remember thinking like that sense of crawling around. You're in this building. You just pass through some guys. You showed them your papers. The enemies aren't automatically aggro. Like, I'm watching some gameplay of it right now. But if you
Mm-hmm.
hang around them too long and you act too suspicious, then they'll aggravate. So it's this weird, like, you want to go through the level. If you show up, and it was interesting, if you showed the guy the papers too many times in a row, he would be like, wait a minute, these don't look right.
Yeah.
There's these like little touches they would do to the gameplay mechanics, what you just said. It wasn't just like, go here, shoot guy, go here, shoot guy.
Yes, they had other objectives, and on top of that, with that stealth thing, you never knew if or when your disguise was going to fail. So the whole time you're walking through that, there's still this level of tension where you're like, "Am am I going to get caught here? Am I going to have to
Yes.
shoot my way out of this?"
And all
Like,
you have is this little
yeah,
silenced handgun. You're in, yeah, it gives you this stress.
it's it's wonderful. Um, it's so well done, and it makes me. It adds to that immersion, man. Like, I don't know, for a PS1 game, it's surprisingly immersive. Like, I'm not going to say it's like realistic now, especially because of what we're used to now. But like,
Yes.
for the time, it was super realistic. But I still think the immersion surprisingly works. And the only caveat I will give to that is that I don't know if that's my nostalgia talking or if it's actually still like good at immersion. Because I'm a sucker for this era of like PS1 type of stuff. Like, I love the visuals of this game. I don't know what it is. I still think they're visually really fun to look at, even though I objectively they aren't very good looking by modern standards. But it's like one of those things where the visuals I can tell I still like due to nostalgia. I don't
Yes.
think people who aren't nostalgic for it will enjoy the visuals as much as I do.
I
But
would
with
agree.
the
Like, the
yeah,
PS1, a lot of people say PS1 era games have not aged well, and I can see that argument. But and I also have that same bias. It's my favorite console. I love that era of games. I think the art direction, the visuals still hold up. Now, I was playing this week on an emulator at higher resolutions, but a lot of what, and people say, oh, that fixes it. But oftentimes a higher resolution will highlight weaknesses in art direction sometimes, because a lot of times games would hide certain things or blemishes because they know you're playing on a CRT and they know you're playing at a certain low resolution. And when you play them at high resolution, sometimes they look worse. Medal of Honor is not the case. I don't think it's just your bias. I think the art direction for this game knew what the limitations were, as you mentioned in the notes. They were very conscious of the limitations of the PS1, and they designed not only the narrative, but I also would imagine, even though there's no direct quote in your notes, that a lot of the way they approach textures and views and like corners and what to
Hmm.
show and points of interest was all done with the hardware limitations in mind, which makes it still feel like you're right. It's an old game. If you've never played this game and you're listening and you want to go try it out, yeah, this is not going to be Crisis on a RTX 4090 with all the bells and whistles. But if you're into retro games, and most people who are listening to this podcast, I assume, would be, we all have a soft spot for retro aesthetics. Now,
Hmm.
pixel art, I would argue, in general, has a higher appeal for most retro gamers. Like it ages better.
I think even non-retro gamers, I think it's
It's just
closer.
better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's closer to more traditional art. Might not be the best term for it, but it's closer to like a drawing or a painting than these low res polys or low
Yes.
poly 3D characters.
And so some people will play this game and be like, ooh, this is gross. But I think more people would be pleasantly surprised because they designed the textures and the models all within the PS1 limitations in mind. And I'm watching some footage, and even the guns have sort of mock fake lighting when you walk. It looks like light is moving across the scope. Obviously,
Hmm.
it's not real time lighting. It's all, as mentioned in the notes, it's all smoke and mirrors, but it was done very, very tastefully. And they have, like, I'm watching some footage of a level where there's a spotlight and you walk, and as when you walk past the spotlight, the level's kind of lit up. Again, it's not real lighting, but it's done well. And I think if you were to pick a PS1 game and say that the art style has aged well, this would be not my number one pick, but it would be up there. I Most people look at an old PS1 game, they see the texture wobble, they see the
Hmm.
texture seams, all that stuff, and they go, "Ugh, this is gross." And it kind of is. And I realize that I have a soft spot for that. But I would make the argument that this game still looks pretty good. And for a PS1 game, it looks amazing.
You want to talk about fucking texture wobble? You should look at the port of Medal of Honor Underground, so PS1 title, the sequel to this, for the Game Boy Advance.
Oh my God. I didn't even know it existed.
You you look up a video of it, you will want to tear your eyes out. It like the textures scale and move in the strangest of ways that I can't even fucking describe. It is awful. Whenever I do my inevitable Medal of Honor Underground episode, I will definitely kind of shout that out because it's such a bizarre, strange port of it.
Oh, yeah, this is horrible. And the frame rate is like 3 frames a
Yeah.
second. It is so bad.
It's like literally that Jeff Goldblum quote from Jurassic Park. They were so infatuated with the idea that they didn't stop and think if they should or whatever. I paraphrased it, but yeah.
The first quote on this YouTube video of it, this game makes the original look like a masterpiece.
Dude, I own this. I own that game. I own a physical copy of both the PS1 and the GBA version of Underground. It's a wild experience.
Yeah, this is
Um,
pretty rough. Yeah. So I mean, if you're someone who hasn't played this game, look, play FPS is on the PlayStation 1. I would not say the PlayStation 1 is suited as like the best FPS machine. Um, but if you are to try an FPS on the PS1 from this era, it is definitely one of the strongest I would recommend. In fact, I'm trying to think of, if you were to think of an FPS, not this, but another FPS on the PlayStation 1, which one do you think is better? I mean, I do like Underground maybe a little more than the original.
I haven't played Underground in a while, so I can't say for certain which one is better. Um, I do think Underground suits more the gameplay style because if you're a resistance fighter, you're not like the original Medal of Honor. It always kind of felt like, well, you're a soldier who's not doing soldier things. I understand you work for the OSS, but because you're like a Navy, like a not a Navy, sorry, a pilot, it kind of makes sense why you're not a soldier doing soldier things. But I think like in terms of narrative, it makes a lot more sense for Underground because you're a resistance fighter. You literally don't have an army to fight for you, so you have to fight with guerrilla tactics and spying and sneaking in around things. And I mean, hell, that game begins with Manon seeing her brother get killed. So like that's fucking metal, man. I really loved Medal of Honor Underground when I played it. Never beat that one either. And real quick, just to kind of what I was saying, I mentioned before I didn't beat this game when I was the original Medal of Honor when I was a kid. I always got stuck on the final level. And the final level, I mentioned before how, the V2 rocket goes up and we're laughing at how you're like standing right next to the explosion in a quote unquote explosion proof bunker or some shit like that. What blew my mind about, or no, I shouldn't say blew my mind. What I got stuck on was the lead up to the level. Like I said before, you come out of a tunnel on a railway, and there's some shit around the rail track on the track. But if there's a like this weird like canyon looking type of thing off to the left that you have to go across or go through, and then the base where the V2 rocket is in, it's like in this like valley, almost like this dugout basin. And all I remember is that there are dudes who shoot rocket launchers at you, and I could not for the life of me kill everyone when I was a kid. For some reason, every time I would pop my head out, I remember I would get killed instantly. And I was always so mad. I'm like, why can't I beat this game? Something I totally forgot to bring up. My dad doesn't play a lot of video games, but him and I bonded a lot over the Medal of Honor games. Uh, and him and I would play a lot of these. He actually beat this game. I remember I was mad at him for beating it before me. Because I'm like, I'm the one that plays games more than you, motherfucker. No, but he beat the game and I could not, and it honestly irked me for a while. Now he would always beat the Medal of Honor games before me. We played Frontline and Rising Sun and all the other a lot of the PS2 ones, and it I think that's another reason why the series has such a nostalgic hold on me, is because of that. But to finish what I said before I wax nostalgic about the series to close out the episode, I couldn't get past the final level because every time I pop my head out, some dude with a fucking bazooka would just shoot me. Fun fact, I don't think I included it on the notes, but and I don't even remember who said this. It might have been the art director or one of the it might have been Heilman, the programmer that I mentioned before. But one of the things he was proud of, I think it was Heilman, but I'm really not entirely sure now. I'm trying to actually look to see if I can find it. Yeah, so this was Heilman. He developed and this is a quote from Pat's book. Once again, shout out Pat Hickey Jr., the minds behind the games. This is from the minds behind the PS1 games. I developed a dynamic vertex lighting, so the bazooka would light the things around it as it streamed down a corridor and create scorch marks on the wall after it exploded upon impact. It also allowed enemy shots to illuminate their surroundings as they fired at you. And then he also mentions, I also wrote the code to have the ability to remove limbs by collapsing all the vertices around a point and spawning a new limb object at the location where it could fly off and fall to the ground. So yeah, I thought about the bazookas thing because I thought about that because of the bazookas thing, but which once again another technical marvel. There was dynamic lighting in this, not to the extreme, shadows, lighting and shadows didn't react to everything, but the fact that like he was able to create a light source from the bazooka and have it kind of emit dynamically as it traveled along was pretty impressive for the PS1 and for 1999 on a home console.
Yeah, it's even more impressive on the PS1. I looked up because I'm like, I can't think of like other FPSs on the PS1 that even come close to this as far as the grounded and all that stuff. I looked up FPSs on PS1. It's because there wasn't. Like, there's one Delta Force Urban Warfare, which I'd never heard of, and I watched. It's like a Delta Force kind of like SWAT teams. But I'm like, that could be it. And I like click on it and it's PS3. So I'm like, okay, Google got this one wrong. Then I clicked on, okay, just show me the actual PS1 one. The only one I could find that had as much 3D like bells and whistles. I've never heard of it. And it came out in 1997 and was developed by Psygnosis, which is one of my favorite developers. So I'm kind of mad I'm not aware of this game because they made Wipeout. And it's called there's two different names. This article is calling it Life Force Tenka, but the ISO that I found on archive.org is called Codename Tenka. And while you were talking, I went through and looked at all these other PS1 RPGs, and they're either like
You
Duke
mean
Nukem.
FPSs?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, I'm so RPG head. I've been saying that FPSs. Thank you for correcting me. I mentioned Disruptor. They're like Duke Nukem or Doom or Disruptor, where it's a 3D environment, but the characters and the guns and stuff are 2D sprites. Power Slave is like that. Duke Nukem 3D. The only other one I can find is Alien Resurrection, which came out after, and that's the one that spawned basically the modern FPS control scheme on a dual analog, but that came out later. So Medal of Honor predated it with all its technical wizardry. And then there is Quake 2, which was ported. And that's originally 1997. So, but I'm not sure. This is saying it was ported to PS1, but then I'm reading about it and it's talking about the N64 version. So I'm not even sure if I click through more, maybe it looks like it was for sure ported to the PS1. But I'm looking at all they have Jumping Flash on here. Yep, there it is. Quake 2. Dark Forces was on there, but again, 2D stuff.
It's kind
Dark
of like a
Forces.
Doom clone, Dark
Yeah, it's
Forces.
like a Doom clone. And so I'm going through this and I'm like, yeah, okay. There's a reason why I can't think of any other contemporaries beating it. And then I looked up best FPSs on PlayStation 1 and pulled up like 6 tabs for different lists, and all of them rank Medal of Honor as number 1.
I mean, it set the groundwork for so much, and it revolutionized so much. I think that's a good transition too, to just talking about final thoughts about the game and its legacy, because like dude, I mean, that list says it. I mean, I know we can't always just say, just because someone makes a list doesn't mean it's objective, or if it's this and that, but like you just said, you looked up other PS1. You didn't even look up best PS1 first person shooters. You just looked up PS1 first person shooters, and there's
Yes.
not a lot that stand out.
Nope.
Like there are, I'm sure there's like some decent ports. Disruptor, I think, is low key a pretty decent game that not enough people talk about, especially for being Insomniac's like first game that they published and developed and published. I don't know if they published, but the first game they developed. But like Medal of Honor, it spawned a hugely popular franchise that even had a game come out just somewhat recently, though it has seen, until this game, there was like over a decade gap just about between Above and Beyond and one of the worst fucking names for a game, Medal of Honor Warfighter. It's like,
Yeah.
it's a pretty,
Dude, I remember when that came out, people immediately started clowning it for the name.
oh, and
It's
I,
just terrible.
dude, and I was always a Medal of Honor apologist because I grew up with the series. It always irked me that Call of Duty ended up stealing its lunch. It bothered me that it took the throne, but it did. Like, I can't deny it. One thing, and this is kind of like I don't want to talk too much about it because it's a different Medal of Honor game, and eventually I would like to do an episode on it. Medal of Honor Airborne. It's a game that doesn't get enough fucking credit for shit that it did. You play as a paratrooper and you drop into the battlefield, and you can pick where you land in the battlefield and complete your objectives in whatever order that you want to.
And looks like that's a PS3 game,
Yeah,
according
it
to
came
the
out in like
wiki.
06, 09, maybe. I don't remember off the top of my head, but
Looks like 07.
07. Okay, I was off. Yeah, it's awesome. And the Medal of Honor continued to like do really neat and interesting things. The most, I think, yeah, after the last World War II one, until before Above and Beyond came out a few years ago, I think was Medal of Honor Vanguard, which what you could play on like the PS2 and Wii. And there was a lot of crossover at that time between the PS, like Medal of Honor Heroes and Heroes 2, you can play on the PSP or the Wii for some reason. Like there's weird shit like that. But this game set up a massively successful series, though it has since unfortunately died off. And if it wasn't for Medal of Honor, you wouldn't see Call of Duty. But like Call of Duty, it was massive for a solid like 6 or 7 years. The biggest seller every year was a Call of Duty game, and all of that kind of stems back to what Medal of Honor did and how people saw that and then iterated on the formula, because Call of Duty ended up doing its own thing and all that good stuff. And just so in terms of like what the series has done for the game industry, even just take out sales numbers and shit like that, just there's a lot of amazing things that occurred in this. Michael Giacchino, composer, tech advancements both in terms of how music is used in games as well as AI. As we read, AI used up all 2 megabytes of memory on the system, and just visuals and stuff like that. Like it really was it was something that not a lot of people thought could be done on the PS1, and they were able to do it, and they did it well. And then on a personal note, this game means a lot to me. I played it with my dad. It's something that I will always cherish as like a memory of being able to play these games with him and being excited for new releases and getting them for Christmas. And it's one of those things, like, as a kid, a lot of times you want your parents to be proud of you type of thing, or you want your parents to like the same things you like because you want to have
Yes,
that
yes,
relationship. And so
yeah.
whenever a new Medal of Honor game we got for Christmas, I was just as excited to see him playing it as I was to play it myself. And that was always cool for me. So I will always love the Medal of Honor series, and this game kicked it off and it kicked off my love it. I played that first mission, the down G3 plane or whatever, like so many times because I just loved the design of that level. It was just one of my favorites. So this game and series will always mean a lot to me. It's one of my personal favorites. Yeah. So, Kate, I want to throw it over to you. Final thoughts about the game in terms of its legacy and any other personal thoughts on it.
I looked up some footage of this airborne game. It looks really awesome. When I searched it on YouTube, I found, as you said, some videos claiming this Medal of Honor game does not get enough credit. So it sounds like not all of the sequels were terrible after DreamWorks stopped developing the series.
No, there's a lot. Like Frontline's fantastic, Allied Assault's fantastic, Rising Sun's okay. I liked it a lot, but in retrospect, there's some like it's not great as good. But yeah, it's there's a lot of good stuff out there. It's like after the late PS2 and like when Airborne came out, that's when Medal of Honor was at its worst, and it's a shame because that's why that game got overlooked. But yeah, there's a lot of good games after the initial like two or three. I would say like the first five are really solid, and then after that it starts going downhill.
I'll have to try them because I played 1 and 2, on first one in Underground, and then I can't think of really any PS2 first person shooters I played. I started playing them again on PS3, but so I think the series has a little bit better legacy than maybe I thought. I'm watching this airborne footage and it does look pretty awesome.
It's so good.
But yeah, the first two games were a big deal for me. I like that story you had with your dad. I don't have that same connection with my dad on this particular game, but I had that same dynamic with other games where I was always showing my dad games and trying to like get him wowed or impressed because he'd occasionally look at games and kind of, this is cool. But then he would maybe like talk some shit about the game for whatever reason, like, oh, but there's still an issue here or there. Like, never quite impressed. And I was always trying to get him. And when he was impressed with the game and he thought it was cool, that was always magic. So I could totally resonate with that. This game was that for you. And it makes sense that this game would be. I don't know if I ever showed my dad this game, but when Saving Private Ryan came out, that was a movie that my dad took me to see. And we had a rule in my household. I also grew up pretty religious, like you were mentioning you did. We weren't
Mhm.
allowed to see rated R movies. But occasionally my dad would let me see one if he thought the movie had some sort of educational benefit. And he let me watch Saving Private Ryan because he wanted me to understand that war is not always
It's not something to be
glamorous.
glorified.
It's not glamorous, right? It's actually really dark and brutal. And the movie definitely did that for me. I was like shocked by that movie as a kid. And so I think he would have liked this game. I should have showed it to him and maybe he would have been impressed. But the the game is awesome. The legacy is there. You could maybe, if you're like a super hardcore anti Call of Duty person, you could hate on Medal of Honor for arguably being the precursor to Call of Duty. And a lot of people feel Call of Duty's overall influence on the gaming industry has been negative. And I could see an argument if you wanted to criticize Medal of Honor, for that, I could maybe see an argument. As we mentioned before, I think if you're really against PS1 era visuals and aesthetics, I think you could criticize it for that. The control scheme you could criticize for, but my counter argument would be like no one had figured it out by then, and they did a pretty damn good job for the time being. So I don't think there's a whole lot negative you could say about this game, especially if you're looking at it in the context of the time it came out. It was a technical marvel. I wanted to close with an idea. I was watching a developer interview about Alan Wake 2.
Hmm.
I love Remedy. I love Control of Alan Wake. And they were talking about the creative director for Alan Wake 2 was talking about how video games are actually, they to make a really good video game, a big budget video game, there's a big element of luck because there's so many different things being worked on at the same time. And as a director, you don't really see the game come together towards the end of its development cycle. And if it's not coming together well, it's really hard to fix it because it's just very, he said games are almost like little miracles in and themselves. And so many games fail that we never hear about.
Mhm.
And this seems like that because yes, the team was much smaller. You said it ballooned up to 30 people max is what you researched. And that is a
Yeah.
small team compared to today's. But at the time, that was a big team. And what do you think the odds are of Steven Spielberg making the crossover to video games, getting a writer that wants to
Well,
input all this like grounded history? It's almost a miracle this game came
well,
together and came out.
it is a miracle in the sense because of those things I mentioned before between Columbine and the Medal of Honor Society and stuff like that. But Steven Spielberg has actually been interested in games since the 80s. Like he had a pretty strong hand at even the ET game. Like he so there's a story. Howard Scott Warshaw, the dude who created the infamous ET game for the Atari 2600, he actually met Steven Spielberg in person because Spielberg was interviewing people for the developer job for that game. Because I mean, yes, it ended up being its infamous story, but obviously no one sets out to do that, and
I was
arguably
gonna
it's
say maybe Steven Spielberg was cursed, and the
well
fact that he didn't curse this game is a miracle because he
well,
failed
and
at
arguably
ET.
that was more not even
I know,
Warshaw's
I'm
fault. It
joking.
just argu
That had nothing to do with Spielberg.
yeah.
That's a very,
But
prominent and well documented story.
yeah, and he's so Spielberg has actually always it's like since the inception of gaming has always really liked and admired games, and he that's why he set up his own studio in order to realize that. And I mean it is that itself is a bit of a miracle that someone in the film world was like, I fucking love video games, especially
And
back in the
for
80s.
whatever reason, in 1995, it finally came together. If you're saying he was into it since the 80s,
Yeah.
it took him till 95 to realize. I don't know why. Maybe there was certain road. Maybe he tried twice before and failed to make a game studio, or maybe this was his first attempt at a game studio, which would make it even more of a miracle because your first try, oftentimes people fail until they get things right. It just, and yeah, I can see the argument. Okay, maybe it's not as much of a miracle that Spielberg himself was involved in this game because he's been interested in games since the 80s,
Mhm.
but there's so many moving parts for a game in general to come together. And then it seems like for the time in this game, as you mentioned, World War II, not popular at the time. It just seemed like there was a lot going against this game. And then somehow they did it. The PS1 limitations, they dealt with that. World War II not being famous, they dealt with that. They got Spielberg. Like it's just, I don't know. Like I'm trying to think if this game never came out, how different do you think FPSs would be in general?
That's a very good question. I mean, I don't think FPSs would be that different per se because GoldenEye was already a thing, Doom was already a thing, Quake was already a thing. I don't think FPSs would be that different, but I do think, well, I think in terms of how FPSs play, maybe not that. But
Not
actually,
mechanically, probably. Yeah.
but even so, this game did change. It's not necessarily it didn't change mechanically, but it did change its design a lot. It was a lot slower paced compared to like, as people call it now, a boomer shooter
Yes.
with that type of shit. But it's still so it might not have changed, like the shooting mechanics, but at the same time, you know, without Call of Duty, where would the industry be? So who really knows? It I think more than anything what this game did was it was a stepping stone for a lot of major players in the that would go on to do. I mean, like Steven Spielberg's son is still in the game industry and has done some incredible things. Michael Giacchino, it's not his first composer credit. He started out in video games. He composed Gargoyles for the Genesis. Michael Giacchino, which I had no idea, but it's still one of
That's
his.
actually a really good game. And one of the games I always put forth as some of the best sprite work on the Genesis.
I don't think I've played it, but I will have to check it out. But yeah, so
It's badass.
it I don't know. I don't think that it necessarily would have been as much of an impact. I think its biggest thing that it did was it popularized World War II shooters, which for the detriment, like I don't blame Medal of Honor. I don't even blame Call of Duty for what Call of Duty turned into. I blame corporate suits for shit like that. Like that's the first couple Call of Duty games are legit, like the first three games, and then Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare, even Modern Warfare 2, fucking like fantastic games. Um, but I think more than anything, this game just kind of it it changed a lot. What it did change in the industry in terms of FPSs was the type of content you could do in an FPS. I like this was more educational, like I said before, edutainment. Like you never saw anything like that. And honestly, since you don't really see a lot of first person shooters trying to educate just as much as try to entertain. And this was something that they kept going for quite some time in the Medal of Honor series. So yeah, I would say like this game really did a lot on the technical aspect, with like some of the AI work, some of the how they implemented the sound, how the sound design was really critically acclaimed even for the time, and also just pushing the boundaries of the PS1. So I think that's where its legacy ultimately is. Maybe not so much. I mean, it did change up some things in game design, but overall, I think it's more the technical aspects is where it shines. But the one I think its biggest contribution to design is the edutainment idea, which you just don't see anymore, for better or worse. It's your opinion if you like it or dislike it, but I would like to see more stuff like that. It doesn't have to be World War II either. It doesn't have to be an FPS even. Like what if it's a different genre and a different topic, but it's used to educate people on something with like the documentary style thing? I think that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, I would say like Metal Gear Solid came out before this in 1998, so there were games on the PS1 that were trying to be more cinematic and cross between film and games.
Hmm.
But it was in this early batch, at least on home consoles, of games where they were taking more film influence, and in this case, Steven Spielberg and people who actually worked in film coming over and working on the game. And we've kind of beat all these points at a dead horse, but it did, like, I would agree, gameplay wise, mechanic wise, nothing that it changed, but the edutainment, the attention to detail, purposely going through and trying to ground the game in real history. Like the only other game that I think that's as old as this, I don't know if you ever played Europa. It's like this kind of civilization.
I've never played it, but I've heard of it.
But yeah, Europa is like, that's one of its main appeals, is it's you're playing a game and getting a history lesson at the same time.
Hmm.
And maybe you could argue Civilization in some older games had done that, but I've been looking not only PS1 FPSs but just old FPSs pre 99, and I can't find one that that went for this. So sort of like history grounded film edutainment angle. So it may be the first FPS that did it, and like you mentioned, it's still not a super, what's the word, common route. As you mentioned, you get more educational games like Carmen Sandiego at the time, or Number Munchers or whatever, but Medal of Honor was more entertainment than it was education, but it still had the slice of education and grounded in real history. And from quick Googling around, I can't find a specifically an FPS that did it before Medal of Honor. I could be wrong, but so far, from quick Googling as we've been talking, I can't find one.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. I would love to see more of it though. I think it was a really cool format, but um, I do think though we should start wrapping up this episode. We got to wrap this up. We've been going on for a good amount, and I think that's a good way to end the discussion on the game itself. Like the fact that we are talking about how it was kind of like this edutainment first person shooter that hasn't seen the likes of it. That's kind of its legacy, for better or worse, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with the politics of it or not. Even this game really did change a whole bunch of stuff though, and it like the fact that we can't think of another example of an edutainment game kind of like in the same vein as this is kind of its proof of legacy in and of itself. So
I would agree.
that I think that's a good place to end this episode. So, Cade, Thank you once again for joining me, my friend. This has been a lot of fun. This actually, while the episode may not has gone as long as some of my other episodes, our conversation off mic listeners when we had like a
Yeah,
2 hour.
we talked 2 hours before even recording, so we've been talking for 4 hours. We always end up talking for a long time whenever
We
we catch
do.
up like once or twice a year and have long conversations.
And conversations were like really deep topics. Where like we don't speak for like 7 months, and then we get into the most serious conversations, and we talk about video games. It's a great time.
Yeah, it's
Um,
fantastic. Always happy. Anytime you want me on to help talk about a game, if it's a PS1 game, you can pretty much count me in.
I will keep that in mind. So, Cade, where can the good people find you online?
I do the Gaming Memories podcast where I primarily interview people like Josh and other podcasters, musicians, artists, and I get to know them about asking them what their favorite games were growing up, what their first console was the first games that turned them into a gamer. So it's primarily an interview based podcast, but video game themed. I get to know the guest through talking about video games and then obviously talk about their creative endeavors. So Josh has been on the podcast. You can find that. I don't know what episode it is, but just look up Still Loading Podcast Gaming Memories. It'll be there. As mentioned earlier in the episode, my memory was correct. He was a Nintendo kid, but apparently had an uncle with the PlayStation 1 and played a lot of Medal of Honor, which we didn't talk about, I think, on your interview. So there's always more to learn from people about their gaming taste. And I think it's a very good way to get to know someone. If you're a gamer, which a lot of us are, that's why we're listening to this podcast, and you can talk to another gamer about the games they played growing up, I think you can learn a lot about somebody. And I think it's really, really fun. I do only an episode once a month. I'm not near as consistent as professional as Josh. So just check in. I might have a new episode, I might not, but I also make content for the social medias, Gaming Memory. I try to do short little educational videos. And to be honest with you, I might translate if you're okay with this, Josh. I'll give you credit. There's so much cool stuff about this game. I might make a series of short videos on TikTok and Instagram talking about these, or maybe a short YouTube video. And I will just shout out this episode and you to give you credit. But I like to make like 30-second little videos about games. I cover a lot of mods. I'm
Mhm.
really into mods, piece like modding old games with texture updates and community mods and yada yada yada. That's sort of my angle. And I do that more often in the podcast. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm as legitimate as Josh. Josh has been really consistent for, dude, 5 years, 6 years. You've been doing this podcast.
I would not 9.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
uh,
Because when I brought you on, you had like a stint, and then you kind of slowed down, and then you like soft relaunched the podcast, right?
yeah, I would do like a couple episodes, a couple months in a row, and then take like 9 months off, do another batch of like a weekly batch of shit, and then another 9 months off. And then in 2017, I started going bi-weekly, and then in 2020, I went weekly. And then switched back to bi-weekly after my kid was born, and then it's been weekly pretty much since the spring/summer of 2021 until now.
Yeah. So Josh is a legitimate content creator. Definitely follow him. If you just want some variety, you can check my stuff out. There may or may not be something new. I can't make any promises.
Well, I always enjoy your stuff, Kate. I like seeing your videos on Instagram. I don't have TikTok, so that's why when I see it pop up, I always enjoy watching them. And I also enjoy your podcast. I like that it's not it kind of explores more the individual. Like you said, you can learn a lot about a person by their talking about their gaming memories, and you use that as a great stepping stone into talking about shit that like I never would have expected, and both things that are like fascinating and bizarre. It's a good
Yeah.
time. Gaming
I should
memories.
be a disclaimer. Sometimes we don't talk about video games that much, but it is what it is.
It's fine as long as you enjoyed it. It's your podcast. That's all that matters. Of course, and then of course, as for myself, as usual, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StillLoadingPod on all of them. If you want to email me, you can email me stillloadingcontact@gmail.com. Also, oh yeah, Threads is a thing now at StillLoadingPod on Threads, Threads by Instagram or whatever the hell.
Wait, you're
Uh,
on Threads?
I'm on Threads, baby.
Oh, Shiza. I gotta find you. I haven't done one for gaming memories yet, but I hear everyone talking about it.
I mean, it's easy to do. You can literally like log onto your Instagram and then there'll be a thing where like, do you want to create a thread off of this? And it's like, yes, because it's all like they'll have you download an app and you can just literally import all your follows over. It's really easy.
Okay. I
I
gotta
think
do
that's
that.
why Threads has been doing so well, is because it literally just takes the existing user base of Instagram and it's like, you're over here now. It's honestly
Yeah.
kind of smart. Anyway, so yes, at Still Loading Pod over there as well. If you want to support the show, please consider giving it a 5-star rating or review on Apple Podcasts or whichever podcasting app you use, because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy. And if it is to believed, it pleases the algorithm gods and it helps more people find the show. I don't know if that's true or not, but I will gladly take it either way. And then if you want to support it monetarily, there's a patreon.com/stillloadingpod. For $1 a month, you'll get the episodes a few days earlier at better audio quality, as well as patron voting rights, which the most recent patron poll, Epic Mickey won. And so I will be doing an episode on Epic Mickey in a few months. And then I believe, I guess that will come out in October. I want to say October. And then there'll be another patron poll in October as well. So people can look forward to that. For $4 a month, you'll get everything at the previous tier, as well as access to 2 bonus episodes, including my review of where I'm painstakingly going through 8 games at a time, all 220 games on one of those bootleg knockoff handheld systems, which has been a glorious experience. If you want to learn what Curly Monkey is like, that is the series for you. And then the final level I will shout out is the $5 level, where you get everything at the $4 and $1 tiers, and you get access to Still Bonding, my James Bond podcast, where me and a bunch of friends bond over 007. When this episode comes out, I believe Moonraker will still have been the newest episode. So if you like the Roger Moore era of James Bond, we are deep in the throes of more. So yeah, check that out. It's patreon.com/stillloadingpod. And of course, the most important shout out is the Bit by Bit Foundation. The Bit by Bit Foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to put video games and video game consoles in the hands of kids receiving inpatient care at hospitals. So if you want to support them, go to bitbybitfoundation.org and consider donating. And that is all the time I have for you today. Thank you all so much for listening. Kade, thank you once again, my friend, for joining me.
Always. Anytime.
And with all that said, listeners, I will see you all next time.
Bye-bye.